Welcome to this IANA webinar, Inside the Numbers, 2019 Mid-Year Review and Outlook. I'm Hal Pollard, the Director of Education at IANA, and it's great to have you join us. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters from the TTX Company, Melissa Peralta, Senior Manager of Economic Planning, John Woodcock, Director of Market Development, and Peter Wolf, Director of Market Development. They'll be talking about current economic conditions and a review of the first half of 2019, the year-to-date IANA numbers, look at international and domestic intermodal, and wrap up with questions. So, let's get started. Melissa?
Hello. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. I'm going to take you through a couple of slides that I hope describe where the economy is right now. So, to start, it does seem like GDP growth has softened since last year. GDP growth in 2018 was 2.9%. Which was higher than average coming out of the recession and was largely pushed to that higher level by the tax bill that was passed in late 2017. However, broad indicators are that GDP growth has slowed over the past couple of quarters. So the black line you're seeing is overall annualized GDP growth in the quarter, and it does seem to be slightly softer than last year. I think the more interesting thing that this graph shows is that there's been a tremendous amount of volatility, though, in the drivers of GDP growth. So if you look at GDP can be composed into consumption, investment, inventories, net exports, and government. There's been a lot of volatility on the consumption side from the first and second quarter. But even outside of that, there have been large swings in contribution to GDP growth from the inventory side and the net export side. And at this point, we believe that a lot of this is really driven by some of the trade, not just the new trade tariffs, but also the uncertainty caused by trade policy. On the domestic side, things are actually doing pretty well. So it is true that the labor market is very strong right now. The unemployment rate is very, very, very low. That's caused wage growth to pick up some. And so from a pure labor market standpoint, things are going very, very well. And we can see this impact in retail sales, which have really made a dramatic turnaround since the beginning of the year. So retail sales, much like many other things, did great in 2018, in part because of the tax cuts. But then they sharply slowed in January, February, even December of last year. We have seen a rebound over the past couple of months, and that's mostly tied to the positive outlook in the labor market. Now, that said, while a lot of domestic indicators are doing well, the indicators that are more tied to the industrial sector are definitely stronger. So here I'm showing the ISM Purchasing Managers Index. This is a survey that's done of purchasing managers, just asking them essentially what they see their outlook being over the next couple of months. Any reading over 50 indicates that conditions are good. The industrial sector is expected to expand over the next couple of months. But numbers under 50 do suggest that there'll be a contraction. So you can see here that while the ISM index is above 50, it's barely above 50. And indeed, the new export orders have fallen below 50, indicating a contraction in coming months. And again, that's most likely tied towards much of this trade uncertainty. I think another indicator that shows the impact of trade uncertainty and that underlines that the economy is slowing is overall investment. Investment can be divided into residential and non-residential, and the bulk of non-residential is stuff tied to business investment. Non-residential investment fell in the second quarter for the first time since the very beginning of 2016. Now, some of this decline can be tied to softer oil prices. So oil extraction is very, very investment intensive. It requires lots of parts and metal products and just a good amount of investment. So since oil prices are softer than they have been, it's not uncommon to see a contraction in that sector. And indeed, that was the main driver in the large declines in investment at the end of 2015 and the end of 2016. Still, the overall decline in investment is concerning. The other thing I'd want to point out is that residential investment has been declining for a year and a half. So that's somewhat of a separate market, partially tied towards the volatility in the stock market, making it harder for down payments. In fact, the tax bill made home ownership less desirable in many areas. Also, the tightness in the labor market means it's just harder to build than it used to be. But I suppose I wanted to point out that it's actually been a drag on the economy for some time. So there are somewhat mixed messages right now. Many economic indicators are doing fine, are doing great. I've showed you some of them, the labor market, retail sales, they're all doing fine. But there does seem to be a slowdown in the industrial sector specifically. And as I mentioned, a lot of this is tied towards trade uncertainty, towards uncertainty regarding the prices of imports and the ability to pass on any changes in prices to consumers or supply chains or export markets. But one of the best ways I believe to see this uncertainty in the markets is actually in the yield curve. And if you're unfamiliar with the yield curve is the curve that's formed as you plot out interest rates over time. So the interest rate for the 1 month, the 2 month, 3 month treasury. What I'm showing you here is the 10-year treasury less the 3-month rate. And it first turned, normally this is positive because I feel this should be a little bit intuitive. There's more uncertainty over 10 years out than there is over 3 months out. You'd expect people lending money for those longer periods of time to charge more for it than for the shorter periods of time. So this indicator first turned negative in late March. It's been negative mostly since mid-May. And indeed, the gap has expanded over the past couple of days. I also read in the news today, as I said, there are a couple ways of looking at the yield curve. Some people look at the 10-year treasury rate less the 2-month treasury rate. That also has turned negative in recent days. So this is something we watch carefully. I do think it's flashing signs that there's stress in the economy and that the uncertainty is really eating into overall confidence to some extent. Now, why is this important? The yield curve is actually one of the best indicators that a recession is around the corner. So here I'm showing you that same 10-year treasury rate less the 3-month rate going back to the beginning of the century. And generally speaking, once the yield curve turns, let's say, meaningfully negative and stays there for 2 to 3 months, it suggests that a recession is likely to happen within 6 months to a year. Now, I don't mean to be too negative because there are a lot of reasons to believe that this time might be different. For one, the spread between the 10-month treasury rate and less the 3-month rate hasn't gotten down to the negative 0.5 level that it did in previous years. It also hasn't, if you think about the graph I just showed, it hasn't consistently stayed low. So it was around zero for several weeks. There's also, interest rates are so low right now that there's sort of just naturally less ability for there to be a meaningful spread between the short-term and long-term interest rates. And then if you consider the spread in a global context of very low interest rates, Germany has negative rates right now, Japan has negative rates right now, then I think you can construct an argument that global pressures might be pushing down long-term rates. Certainly, outside of the United States, the yield curve is a terrible indicator of recession. So the more global influence there is, the less credibility you might want to put into this. Finally, yield curves can be reversed very quickly. And that can come about by the Fed continuing to lower rates. So it is something concerning. It's something we're watching very closely. We're watching Fed policy that would influence it very carefully as well, but it is a concerning sign. So with that in mind, we do see GDP being pretty strong to the end of this year. Past 2019, things are a little bit less certain. All the same, we do see 2019 finishing the year slightly softer than 2018. Before I finish, I would just want to point out one more thing, and that's Mexican and Canadian GDP are expected to be weak in 2019. And that's just another sign of the implications of the trade uncertainty not only is it impacting U.S. growth, but it's having an influence in Mexico, Canada, and many of the other countries that are seeing their trade policies reconsidered. Thanks for having me. That's all I got. I'm going to turn it over to John and Peter.
All right. Well, thanks, Melissa. That was great. And this is Peter talking. So we're going to run through about 4 slides with the latest IANA numbers, but we're going to go through them pretty quickly and then spend more time discussing the why or what's behind the numbers in John's section on domestic and when I talk about international intermodal. So the first slide, rather depressing, I guess, in the sense that all segments are underwater with the exception of international intermodal, which is basically flat, but everything else is down for the year. And by region, too, the U.S. is down, Mexico's down, and Canada is essentially flat. And again, we'll get into why that's down in just a bit. And looking at it a little differently, just looking at the actual volume for each of the segments, you can see, again, that everything is down. Trailers are down the largest, while ISO containers are essentially flat. And then by region, most IANA regions are down comparing the first half of 19 compared to the first half of 18. But the Northwest, Western Canada, and Mountain Central seem to have eked out some gains. On the other hand, the Southwest region and the South Central region suffered the biggest losses. And looking at some of the specific lanes, we always show a top growth lane, and even when the overall numbers are bad, there's still some winners. And so it looks like the intra-Southeast and Western Canada showed some of the largest gains. And we'll talk again about why that happened in a bit. And then the biggest losers, though, which will show the next slide, unfortunately, the Southwest to Midwest lane, which is really one of the largest intermodal lanes overall, was one of the biggest losers. And I think, as Melissa talked about the trade uncertainty, that lane may be a victim of some of the trade uncertainty. And so that's it for the numbers section. Like I said, I know I went through those quickly, but these will all be online where you can see them. So if you want to go back and look, you can. But now I think we're going to jump into the international intermodal section, and I'll go a little slower and try and talk a little bit more as to the whys of what happened, not just the numbers themselves. So as we start to discuss international intermodal, which I'll sometimes refer to as IPI, or Inland Points Intact, but I refer to it as IPI for short. I think the weak growth, the 0.6% IPI growth in the first half, most likely resulted from 2 issues. First, the overall import growth rate has been pretty low. Through June, imports to the U.S. West Coast were actually down 1.8%. And for full year 2019, TTX forecasts all North American imports to only grow by 1.4%. And I think we talked about this at our February webinar, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the tariffs seem to have pushed a fair amount of cargo forward into December of 2018. You may recall that imports in December grew at just a shade under 20% for that month. And as Melissa explained, currently the economy seems to be doing okay. So the weak import numbers are mainly due to this logistics aspect of shippers bringing in cargo into 2018 to avoid tariffs. And so a lot of that 7.4% growth that you see on the slide for 2018, a good chunk of that was really 2019 freight, which would have added 1 or 2 more points to this year's growth had it been sort of a more normal year. And generally, as imports grow, then that's the trend that you see for IPI. So if the import growth rate is going to be pretty flat, you expect to see an IPI growth rate of something that's pretty flat as well. And then just one more word before we flip slides. I didn't change the title on the slide. We prepared the slide a couple of days ago, and at that point, it looked like their tariffs were going to be imposed in September. And then since then, it seems that the September tariff has been postponed. You may recall that roughly there are about $575 billion worth of imports coming from China. As of now, about $250 billion of those imports have a 25% tariff on them. And what was threatened for September 1st was a 10% tariff on the remaining $200+ billion worth of goods. And now it looks like that tariff has been postponed until mid-December. And it may be a tariff on 60% of the remaining goods, and then 40% may not have a tariff on it. It's not clear at this point. And so I left the title the way it is, really to reflect that, as Melissa pointed out, with other measures in the economy that she's watching, it's just uncertain. And it's hard to make projections and know where things are going to go until you really know what tariff policy is going to be and how long that policy is going to stick. And so, but there's also a second reason why IPI growth has been anemic lately. And I think the next three slides will help explain that. And this slide, slide 23, helps to set the stage. And its background, and I think probably is no surprise to most listeners, the West Coast ports are heavily tied to imports from China. For example, LA Long Beach, 90% of their imports originate in East Asia. And the majority of East Asian imports are really from China, with some volume that originates in Japan, Korea, Vietnam, places like that. On the other hand, cargo that originates in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, and Europe, those land mostly on the East Coast ports. And as we'll talk about in further slides as to why that's important and how that is affecting intermodal demand right now. And then the next slide, slide 24, takes a closer look at what has happened to the origins of the imports since the beginning of the year. Given the imposition of the tariffs, it's not surprising to learn that imports from China are down 5.6%. And total imports from East Asia, which would be the other countries, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, they're up somewhat. And so the combined East Asia is up just 0.3%. So essentially flat growth from East Asia. But imports from South Asia are up 13.8%. And imports from Europe are up 8.6%. And this suggests that production from China is migrating to these regions. It isn't just production leaving China and going to countries that are nearby, but moving to Europe as well as to India and Bangladesh. And as we'll show on the next slide, that as you shift the origin of the import, you wind up shifting the destination or what coast it lands on. So moving goods from China or East Asia to South Asia and Europe, we saw substantial growth in the first half to ports that are tied to South Asia and to Europe, with declining volumes to ports that are closely tied to East Asia. So looking at the chart on the left, imports to eastern U.S. ports were up 8.1%, consistent with a lot of growth in imports from Europe and South Asia, whereas imports to western ports, which are tied to Chinese imports, that actually declined 1.8%. And then the chart, or the pie on the right, simply reflects the fact that there are now substantially more imports who come into the U.S. East Coast than to the West Coast. So one more slide on logistic flows, and then we'll try and tie all this together. So in the past, we've talked about all-water share, and I think we've shown these slides before. And I think the difference between all-water share and this slide and the preceding three slides that I've shown is that all-water refers to traffic that originates in East Asia and that terminates on the east coast of the U.S. or Canada, for that matter. So this really isn't part of the shift in cargo away from East Asian origins, but instead it's traffic that really still originates in East Asia, but now routes to the U.S. East Coast, bringing even more freight to the East Coast. And the port region that has shown the biggest all-water share gains recently is in the Gulf. And this is most likely due to shippers continuing to diversify their supply chain. And I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but for people who have been on the webinar before and have heard me talk about it before, when the Panama Canal expanded in 2016, it enabled much larger vessels, 14,000 TEU ships, to pass through the canal and bring more freight at lower cost to the East Coast. And so there was this question about how much freight would actually migrate to the East Coast because of the vessel economics. And when you look at the trend over the past couple of years, the region that is showing the most growth is the Gulf region. And ironically, those ports in the Gulf mostly Houston, but also New Orleans and Mobile, they're served in ships that are relatively small. The average, well, I'm not swearing at anybody, I gotta say this carefully, the average ship size is less than 6,000 TEUs. So it's not this monster ship with monster economics that are lowering the cost of ocean container shipping. And what it seems to be is that large retailers want to establish another distribution area in Texas and bringing a lot of freight into the Houston and the Gulf region. So it's more for strategies of diversification of cargo than anything else. But we expect this to continue, and again, that's bringing more freight to the East Coast, and that's going to have an implication for intermodal traffic. And so slide 27 provides sort of the so what. You know, why are we so focused, or at least why am I so focused on understanding where imports arrive? And the answer is simply that if imports land on the West Coast, there's a 70% chance the cargo is going to route inland by rail. But if the goods discharge on the East Coast, there is only a 20 or 25% chance that the cargo is going to route inland by rail. And why that occurs is really just a function of geography, that if a container lands on the West Coast, it's probably about 1,000 miles inland before it gets to the next large population center. And 1,000 miles or 1,500 miles from LA to Chicago. Those are really good markets for intermodal. They're very competitive. Their economics really shine through. On the other hand, if something comes into the East Coast, you can get to a major market inland 300, 400, 500 miles away. Those markets are really truck competitive, and it's harder for intermodal to compete in that space. And so one more slide on logistics, and then one more slide to wrap it up overall for international intermodal. So let's just talk about transloading. And again, longtime listeners might have heard me talk before that TTX defines transloading as the transfer of import cargo from the marine containers, which are the 20s, the 40s, and the 45s, into 53-foot containers. And by definition, if it's transloaded and moving inland by rail in a 53, that's going to reduce the IPI volume. Still moves rail, still intermodal, but it's not the international intermodal volume. And I think what I'm trying to show with these two slides is that as a share of imports off the West Coast, transloading is held pretty constant this year. But because import volumes have declined on the West Coast, then overall transloading volumes have fallen a bit. And it's just a bit of a background. Why would people transload? Sometimes it offers freight rate savings. Instead of shipping 3 40-foot containers inland, you can fit all those contents into 2 53-foot containers. And so shipping 2 containers instead of 3 might save a little money. But it also offers shippers an improved control over their inventory. And the example I like to use is if you think of spring merchandise, barbecues, lawn furniture, barbecue utensils, those all might come from 3 or 4 different origins, and they might land at one port, and then you can take the goods out of one container, put them into a 53 and mix up the contents. So instead of sending one load in a 40-foot container of just barbecues, you can send 53-foot containers to various markets. And you can vary the loads based on what's going on with the weather. So when you're ordering goods, if you're a retailer, you might have to order goods 6 to 8 months in advance. And if there's seasonal merchandise, maybe you're having a nice spring in Nashville and a lousy spring in Chicago. When those barbecues arrive and wherever they arrive, you may want to have the ability to send them more to Nashville to take advantage of the weather, and then hold inventory in California or wherever you're going to hold it, and then ship it later in the season when the weather improves to more northerly climates. So transloading offers a lot of benefits to shippers beyond just any freight rate savings. And you can see from the chart on the left that as a share of imports, it's pretty high, and I think a lot of shippers, it's quite popular. They seem to like it. And so just the last slide on international intermodal. So this just shows our import forecast, and as we talked about, I went through quickly with the numbers, international intermodal this year is growing just 0.6% through the first half. And for the year, we expect it to be literally flat with 0 growth. And again, that's driven by the weak import demand, changing origins due to tariffs, and a little bit of the continuing trend in all-water share pushing freight to the East Coast. And again, just to reiterate the uncertainty, depending where tariffs go, this could change our forecast up or down. So stay tuned and come back for the February seminar. And I'll turn it over to John, and you can talk about international.
Domestic.
I'm sorry, domestic. Yeah. Freud slipped here. I wanted him to talk about international so I wouldn't have to do any work.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon. I'll dig right in here, and we'll start looking at overall market demand in the U.S. for freight. So we'll go to the Cass Freight Shipment Index. This is really a composite of all modes of transportation, and it covers not only truck and rail, but also ocean freight as well as international and domestic air freight. So it's a very comprehensive gauge of overall freight activity in the market. And as you can see, that it reflects somewhat of subdued activity relative to the first half of 2018, really contracting toward 2017 levels. So still really historically at a fairly high level of activity, but certainly off from the go-go 2018 era. The negative year-over-year indication is being driven by a number of factors. As Melissa was talking about, consumer spending is still fairly strong, but the spending has slowed on a year-over-year basis somewhat. And between that and the inventories pre-stocking that Peter was talking about related to tariffs, we've seen some building inventory levels, which on a future state has a negative impact on freight demand. We've also seen reduced drilling activity in the oil and gas sector because of generally lower WTI crude prices, lower overall rail volumes, as well as I was mentioning, the international air. International air freight volumes have been very, very soft this year, and that's associated with the trade war, of course, as well as slower overall global economic conditions. Digging down a little further, going toward the trucking side, let's look at the FTR Truck Loadings Index, and this also illustrates some subdued volume growth. In fact, the only bright spot that you'll see thus far in 2019 is in January, and that blip is really more a factor of comparisons with last year. Last year, in January of 18, we saw a very low year-over-year number, which in turn created a higher number in 2019. But overall, FTR is indicating that trucking demand is overall on a flat to slightly down basis. So we're seeing really stagnant activity in the first half of the year. I didn't put it on here, but the American Trucking Association, the ATA, is reporting similar results with overall truckload shipments down 0.7% on a non-seasonally adjusted basis for the first half. Within that overall segment, the dry van segment is down 1% and LTL is down a whopping 12%. And I'm going to surmise that the LTL segment is down so significantly because of the truck shortage last year, where shippers were actually using LTL carriers to augment their truckload shipments in the face of the dry van shortage. In contrast to that, the ATA also reports truck tonnage, and that's been up slightly for the year. Most recently, the ATA reported a 1.5% increase on a year-over-year basis in June. And so that could talk to densification in the trucking industry and in the freight industry overall. We're not quite sure, but generally speaking, it's, as I said, it's only up 1.5%, so it's very modest growth. So I think that really throughout the transportation market, demand is subdued particularly relative to last year. For many, the demand feels incredibly soft, and it's I think for most, it's feeling softer than what the actual conditions are. Freight demand is actually elevated relative to prior years other than 2018, but the softness is probably being felt due to substantial growth in the trucking capacity over the last 12 to 18 months in particular. The freight boom really started in the second half of 2017, and with that boom, of course, brought a spike in transportation rates. And this allowed carriers the opportunity to provide more competitive compensation for their drivers. And this not only attracted more drivers into the industry, it also stemmed the flow of drivers out of the industry that were expected to leave with the advent of the ELD rules that were put in place in December of 2017. In addition to increased driver supply, the increased freight rates also brought the opportunity for greater profits in the trucking industry. And these higher profits, when combined with the bonus depreciation rules that were brought about under the 2017 Tax Reform Act, prompted many carriers to invest significantly in both power units and trailing assets. Trailing assets mean trailers. So really, really large manufacturing boom on the trucking side, both in tractors and trailers. And then the coincidental slowing demand growth, along with the asset onboarding, has really reduced capacity below long-term averages. As you can see, the long-term average in the orange bar, which is about 91 to 92%. We've fallen below that, and there's significant looseness in the market right now. And it's expected, as you can see, FTR is expecting the capacity to stay pretty loose until older equipment is flushed out of the network in the coming 12 to 18 months. We're going on to the next slide. This is the Class 8 truck orders in North America, and this is really indicative of the buildup of capacity. As you can see, Class 8 truck orders, it's a very cyclical beast. And it was a pretty large build cycle in the past year and a half. According to ACT Research, the active Class 8 fleet is currently up 7% on a year-over-year basis, and they're expecting it to grow an additional 2.5% by the end of the year. This is in part because of the backlog of outstanding truck orders. As you can see in the graph, orders started to fall off dramatically in the latter part of last year, and they're very subdued now. But those orders were up against a backlog that stretches out into December of 2019. So while orders are subdued, Class 8 truck sales are still very high, as you can see in the inset with the blue bars. And so we're expecting a substantial amount of capacity to keep coming into the market through the remainder of the year. To give you some perspective, the Class 8 tractor build in 2018 was 237,000 units, according to ACT Research, and it's expected to be about 256,000 units this year. That is against the typical replacement rate of about 200,000 units. So there is a large amount of capacity that's coming into the market. ACT does expect that in 2020, there'll be as much as a 30% or more decline in Class 8 manufacturing sales and orders. And they believe the Class 8 build for 2020 will come down to about 163,000. So it's kind of a rebound back to below typical averages. Going on to the next slide. So the intermodal market has reacted similarly to the trucking industry in growing the asset base. With last year's traffic surge, we saw nearly 8% growth in the domestic container fleet size for North America. And just to be clear, this does include Mexico and Canada. So in addition to the 7.8% growth we saw last year, we originally expected to see growth of about 6.9% this year. And that's based on our most recent survey that we took in the beginning months of this year. Of course, domestic volume, as Peter mentioned, it's running counter to this expectation. So domestic volume, domestic container as well as trailer, is declining significantly. So we're questioning whether this number is actually going to be realized. We've got some reports from fleet owners that they're reevaluating their purchasing decisions, and some orders have been canceled or postponed. But as of yet, we are not able to ascertain or quantify what the actual number will be coming in at the end of the year. So we do expect some growth, in part to container conversions from TOFC that I'll talk about in a minute. But we are certainly expecting that the final tally of containers will come in somewhere below the 6.9%. So freight conditions, this is not an optimistic or rosy forecast, unfortunately. The best we can say is that we believe that the freight conditions in the domestic container market will stabilize, but they're going to remain soft. We're expecting a somewhat subdued 2019 peak. And while there's moderate optimism around, we certainly don't expect a sudden rebound. The numbers will be helped somewhat by more favorable comparison data compared with, by that I mean the data from the volume loadings in the 2018 months of the second half. And so we are expecting the year to end off with at a negative note, which is really the first time we've had a negative domestic container growth in 15 years plus. Just a little further on this, we do not expect any further lane rationalizations. We haven't heard any. No further rationalizations have been announced by the roads related to PSR, but that's not to say they won't happen. But counter to that, we have heard of some lane additions. So there are some service enhancements, and some of the roads may be reversing course on some of their lanes. So that's some promising news from a volume perspective. TOFC. So this is for those of you that don't know, TOFC is trailer on flat car as opposed to the container double stack containers. TOFC has been bouncing along at fairly stable levels since the Great Recession, where it dropped 35%. So it's in slow decline. We had a resurgence last year, and it was a very big growth. As you can see, it was 10.6%. But we began the year with the trailer market being a particular target of lane rationalizations by the railroads. And over the first half of the year, quite a few lanes were closed for TOFC, which has, of course, affected volume significantly. And we expect to end the year at about 15 to 16% below our 2018 levels. Right now, it's running at minus 10% for the first half of the year. But now that we're realizing the full effect of the lane rationalization, the year-over-year comps for the second half are going to be a little more severe. So in addition to some of the freight migrating back to over the road because of looser conditions and plummeting spot rates on the truck side, as well as the lane rationalizations, we do think that we're going to see some significant container conversions. So this is a conversion from a TOFC product to a COFC version. So as you can see illustrated here, this is an illustration of a temperature-controlled container. Temperature-controlled containers have been a bit of a niche market. On the container side, the TOFC has really been the majority of the temperature-controlled movements for the last 10 years. It's been very difficult to convert the temperature-controlled market into containers for a variety of reasons, but one of which was the carrying capacity of the container. Because of the need for the container to fit in a 53-foot footprint that is the well car, the container actually had to have less floor space than a typical 53-foot temperature-controlled trailer, which has its reefer unit on the exterior of the box, outside of the 53-foot footprint. So there was a competitive disadvantage of using containers versus trailers. Last year, a temperature-controlled reefer manufacturer came up with a new, what they call the slimline reefer unit that allows an additional row of pallets. And we believe that this improved design is going to make the container more effective relative to trailers. And we couple that with the fact that the railroads are providing incentives for the carriers to convert over from TOFC to COFC. We believe there's going to be more widespread adoption of the reefer containers. To give you a feel for how big of an impact this may be, temperature control product is approximately 30% of all TOFC movements right now. So if you saw a complete conversion of the TOFC to COFC on the temperature controlled side, that could be as much as a 10% impact further on the trailer market. So just one slide on the movements by size. The orange bar are the mid-length trailers. Those are used primarily by the parcel and LTL carriers. That's just been in slow decline for a number of years now, but they are used based on logistical imperatives of the carriers themselves. We're seeing that the 28-foot pups that are used by both parcel and LTL remain at pretty solid levels, and that's really being helped by the e-commerce growth, while the 53s are starting to lose momentum. Of course, the 53s are where the temperature-controlled trailers are, as well as a lot of the over-the-road swing traffic, drive freight, that in times of really tight capacity, the carriers will move to TOFC, and when capacity loosens up on the truck side, that volume will move back to over the road. So that's all I have on the domestic side.
So we got a couple of more slides on what we're watching.
So I'll talk about a couple things that we're looking at that could be possible tailwinds for the domestic market end of 2019 into 2020. So as most of you know, that the ELD rules, which is the electronic logging data, this is the automated logging devices that are in trucks that govern a driver's hours of service, or really monitor the driver's hours of service and prevent, and I put quote unquote, prevent the drivers from cheating on relative to their paper logs that they used to use. While the rule for ELDs was first put in place in December of 2017, they did grandfather what were called automatic onboard recording devices, which were not tamper-proof, I guess you could say, unlike the ELDs. And the FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, is requiring that all carriers hire their AOBRDs in December of this year and move completely to ELDs. at this point, we understand that up to 50%, the number's probably in the low to mid 40s right now, but up to 50% of existing Class 8 vehicles are still not compliant with this rule. So there's going to be a lot of catching up for the motor carriers to do, particularly the smaller carriers. And because of the lower likelihood of drivers cheating on their logbooks using ELDs, we're expecting a productivity impact of up to negative 3%. So that means that essentially 3% of the capacity will be taken out of the market in December. That could tighten up capacity. That's really not considered in the slides that we'd shown previously. But if this does happen, that could tighten up the market a little bit and be favorable for intermodal. The second issue is going to be a little more gradual, and the FMCSA is also introducing a drug and alcohol clearinghouse beginning, I think it's January 5th of 2020. And this is really a national database that if you're a driver and you're subjected to a drug test, either pre-employment or post-accident or on a random basis that's required by DOT, if you come back with a positive, your drug test gets registered in this national database, and it's there for everyone to see. It's actually private. You as the driver have to provide permission for access, but it's guilty if you don't allow access. So if you're a driver that is going to a new carrier and the new carrier says, I'd like to get access to your drug screening, and you refuse, you're not going to get hired. So this is going to be gradual. We're not sure how quickly the impact is going to be. I've talked to a number of carriers about this. And the feeling is, like I said, it's going to be gradual, but probably by the end of 2020, it may have an impact on as many as 3 to 5% of all drivers. One interesting sidebar on this is that in talking with some of the carriers, they think that driver turnover may go down because they don't want to be subjected to the pre-screening, which would flag them. So any way to avoid a drug test would be good. And so that's actually a net bonus for the carrier base. Okay, Peter?
And next slide, similar to John, there's a possible tailwind coming at the beginning of next year for international intermodal as well. For those not familiar, IMO 2020 refers to new rules propagated by the UN. The IMO is an agency of the UN that require ocean carriers to burn ultra-low sulfur fuel with less than 0.5% sulfur. In some cases, might be 0.01%. Or ocean carriers can install scrubbers and continue to use bunker fuel, but the scrubbers are expensive as well. So it seems that without a doubt, ocean carrier costs are going to increase as a result of this. The question is how much and how will they be applied? How much will the cost increases pass through to rates? And will rates for all water traffic increase at a greater rate than rates that are simply trans-Pacific from East Asia to the U.S. and Canadian West Coast? So sort of a lot to watch, a lot of moving pieces. It's unclear where rates are going to go. The low sulfur fuel is about $200 more per ton than bunker fuel. And some estimates have that spread increasing to $250 or even higher as the demand increases to burn the low sulfur fuel when these rules go into effect on January 1st. So we'll have to watch that. One container burns about 0.8 or 80% of a ton, 0.8 of fuel. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words.
0.8 metric tons
of fuel per 40-foot container to the West Coast, and then double that to the East Coast. So if the rates double as a result of the fuel cost doubling, so you're going to pass through the fuel cost through a bunker surcharge or some other measure, rates to the West Coast could rise $200, rates to the East Coast, all water rates could rise $400. Now you have a $200 cost spread. Is that going to push freight back to the West Coast? We'll have to see what those rate spreads are. It could actually have an impact in John's world on the domestic side, because if there's a big crunch in refining capacity, domestic fuel price might go up, pushing up fuel costs. And the way that might play out is railroads burn less fuel per ton than trucking. So you could see ironically, an increase in domestic intermodal traffic as a result of this. We'll have to see. And it may not have much of an impact, depending on ocean carrier pricing and other factors, on the international side. So a lot of pieces to watch, and it's really quite unclear how things are going to shake out at this point.
Well, thanks, fellas and ladies. That was a terrific kind of walk through where we are and where we might be going. It's kind of interesting. You clarified a lot in your things to watch of questions that people were asking throughout the session, so I think you were lining up. We definitely had some questions around IMO 2020, definitely had some questions around what the potential upsides of some of the potentially negative things that are happening in the trucking market and the over-the-road market may look for intermodal. A couple of questions that I think you touched on, but it's probably worth going back because I want to make sure we clarify it for folks. One question is, 2018 looks like an anomaly. Is that right? 2019 looks like it will be more in line with 2017 when it wraps up. Throw that out to you guys.
From a freight demand perspective?
I'm assuming so, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't clarify.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, okay. And then in terms of with the softening of the market, does it look like this will allow the network to kind of improve some of its congestion challenges that it had kind of as a hangover from last year? I think they're looking particularly at the southern Midwest, sort of Memphis and Chicago areas. Any insights on how the slowing of volume may help improve overall efficiency because there's just fewer boxes moving around?
So I'll defer to Peter on some of this, but I'll take a stab at it. I think some of the congestion that we had in 2017 and 2018 was not only volume growth, but it was also disruption from service changes associated with PSR. And while we had that, one of the actions that the roads have taken is not only are they cleaning up their networks and they're operating much more fluidly than they were last year, in part probably because of lower volumes, but they've also taken steps to, I guess, improve throughput in their terminals with regard to demurrage. And I know it's been controversial, but they've been taking steps to provide punitive charges on longer detention of containers and assets inside the terminals. And that is really in part to stimulate throughput and fluidity in their terminal operations.
And I'll just defer to John, but because John deferred to me. But I think on the international side, there's so many moving parts. There's so much in flux that it's really hard to see some of this stuff. So I could envision next year where some freight moves back from the East Coast to the West Coast as things become more fluid through IMO 2020. And, when you look back at the Panama Canal, when everybody talked about the Panama Canal and the cost savings that would accrue from it, it was basically about $200 per container, which is the value of operating maybe an 8,500 TEU ship instead of a 4,500 TEU ship. And so that moved perhaps some freight to the East Coast, but it wasn't a giant amount. So that can move some freight back to the West Coast if you have that same $200 spread. But at the same time, depending on how tariffs shake out, you can see freight continuing to migrate to South Asia and to Europe, and that's going to bring freight into the eastern ports. And so to sort of balance that out, you might move freight that still really does come from Asia to save fuel, move it back. And it's going to be really hard to tell, is this congestion? Is this, all those pieces will make it really hard to see. There's going to be a lot of movement, but exactly why, you can't pin it on any one thing. So in terms of the crystal ball, I don't think that answers the question about capacity, but I think the retailers and shippers are going to be moving a lot of boxes around differently next year. And it's just going to be hard to sort out whether it's because of capacity issues, more fluid, less fluid.
Yeah, I don't think this is just, the congestion and capacity was certainly not just an issue with the railroads last year. It was also very apparent in the trucking industry. And I think because of the demand, it created calls by the trucking industry to the shippers to be more carrier friendly or more trucker friendly. And so you created more drop and hook situations where the driver could drop a trailer instead of waiting. It created more the shipper of choice discussion where carriers would avoid shippers that had bad behavior with regard to long-term detentions and loading times. And so I think we can only hope that a lot of what happened last year with regard to congestion and the mitigants that were put in place to improve fluidity are going to stick in this looser environment, because it's going to have long-term value in the market.
Great. There's a couple of other questions that I've gotten from a couple of folks. Some are really interested in this new notion of the slimline reefer container. Are those being tested on the roads now? And is there a timeline for how those are going to roll out? And
Sure. Well, we're kind of second party to this. We're not first party participants to this market. So our knowledge is a bit limited. But as far as we know, these are already out on the road. They're running their commercial products out on the road and out on the rail. And they're commercial products. So they are operating. And as far as we know, they're operating to commercial expectations. How quickly they'll be adopted, that's another question. We're trying to get our arms around that right now. We have heard that there's going to be increased conversion from TOFC to COFC and the temperature controlled segment this year. So, based on our census that we take a couple times a year with regard to the domestic boxes out in the market, we are seeing new players get into the reefer market or expand their position in the reefer market. How much of that has to do with that new type of container and the slimline unit, and how much of that has to do with the railroad's carrot and stick approach, trying to prompt conversions from trailer to container? I'm not sure what the balance is between the two.
Right. No, it makes sense. Let's try to sneak in one last question. With domestic traffic down slightly, will Class 1 railroads try to directly compete with lower spot market truck competition?
We're kind of looking at each other here in the room. I think that's a question you have to ask the individual railroads what they
that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Melissa, John, and Peter. That was a wealth of information you just shared, and I want to thank you for spending time today breaking down the numbers and telling us what to be looking for. For more information about topics like this, IANA membership, and how to get engaged, please visit intermodal.org or email us at info@intermodal.org. For more information on subscribing to IANA data products, the Intermodal Volume Analyzer, the Historic Intermodal Volume Analyzer, and the ETSO database, please visit the Resource Center at intermodal.org. Thanks for joining us at IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.